So you've brought the rules or heard the name and want a quick rundown on what Oathmark is and how to play. Oathmark is a rank and flank fantasy wargame where you move blocks of models across the battlefield to outmaneuver and defeat your opponent. There are quite a few games in this genre, but a couple of things that make Oathmark really stand out from other games are the speed of play, scalability, and that there are no set army lists. My name is Chris, and welcome to the Ash and Stone channel. Units in Oathmark are easy to move about with minimal measuring, and combat actions are quickly resolved using a couple of rolls with a handful of dice, making the game fluid and fast-paced. You can play a great game with a single box of the official figures per side, that's 30 figures each, though there are no stipulations on what miniatures you must use. Just use whatever takes your fancy or whatever you have on hand. From there, the game scales well into hundreds of figures per side. No set army lists may seem a little strange at first, but rather than providing a pre-selected list of units like a Kingdoms of Men or Orc Hordes with their own lore and backstories, Oathmark allows you to build your own kingdom, containing the units that you want to use, justified by your own lore and background. You can build a kingdom of just elves or the undead, or you can mix and match and create a kingdom where dwarves and goblins live and fight side by side, or the orcs of the Silent Wastes have sworn fealty to the human king Asulf of Highburn in exchange for fertile lands and access to the tradeways. Sprinkle in a handful of monsters like trolls, lindworms or barghists, and you will quickly find your kingdom filling up and the desire to conquer more territory grow. It's designed for miniatures on 25mm square bases, but don't let that hold you back. I use 25mm rounds because I am contrary, and a movement tray easily adjusts for any variation. So how do you play? Well, here's a fairly brief overview covering the basics. First things first, Oathmark uses D10s rather than the traditional D6s, so all dice rolls are made with a 10-sided dice. You'll need 5, though it's nice to have one extra that's a different colour in order to stand out. Infantry units contain between 1 and 20 models, arranged 5 across and up to 4 ranks deep. Cavalry units comprise of 1 to 10 models, 5 across and 2 ranks deep. And monsters may be either single figures or a unit containing 3 models in a row depending on the particular creature. Each game turn starts with an initiative roll. Both players roll 2 dice, and the player who rolled the highest on a single die wins. If both players rolled the same high, then whoever rolled the second highest die wins. If you're still tied, roll again. The player that won initiative then selects one of their units and makes an activation roll. This is to see if the unit can follow orders or dithers about and ruins the entire plan. Elves are easy to activate, goblins less so. Rolling 2 dice, you want one of them to be equal to or greater than the activation stat of the unit. That fully activates your unit, which is great. If both dice are below the activation stat, well, bummer. All is not lost though, as you still get to make a simple action. More on those later. Players take it in turns to activate units, so thankfully you don't have to stand by idly while your opponent moves a whole army of goblins. Once your unit is activated, you can do up to 2 actions with it. Actions include moving, manoeuvring, shooting, or any special abilities a unit may have. Units can only activate once in a turn, and once all units have been activated, a new game turn begins. Moving is very straightforward. You literally move forward up to the unit's move stat in inches. Or you can move backwards or sideways up to half, all in direct straight lines. Moving is the only action that you can do twice in a turn. If you use your second action to move, it's at half speed, quarter sideways. If you move into an enemy unit, that becomes a move into combat, and a round of combat is fought. Manoeuvring is less straightforward, but very simple. There are 3 different maneuvers: pivot, wheel, or about face. Pivoting rotates your unit around the unit's officer. That's this guy in the centre of the front rank. The officer remains in the same place on the table, with the rest of the unit rotating around his position. You can go as far as you like, right around to where you started, though that does seem like a waste of an action. Wheeling is up next. You pick one of the corners of the unit, either the corners of the front rank or the rearmost full rank, and planting that corner into the ground, spin the unit around that point. Once again, you can wheel in a full circle if you're so inclined. About face is the final manoeuvre and probably the easiest. You just spin the unit around 180 degrees on the spot. Well, I guess technically you spin all the figures around 180 degrees and then move the officer into the right position, but who's got time for that? Shooting is the next action. If a unit is armed with a missile weapon, it can, surprisingly enough, shoot, though you can only shoot once in a turn. We'll cover more on this later. The final type of action is special abilities, which a number of different units have. This covers things like spells or Dragon's Breath, though they are beyond the scope of this video. If the unit failed to activate, it may only perform one simple action, rather than any two. Simple actions include moving, though not into combat, manoeuvring, and shooting. One more quick thing before we get into the meat of combat, and that is a unit's facings and arcs. A unit has a front, 2 flank, and 1 rear facing. Attacking a unit on the flank or rear will give you a huge advantage in combat and ensure that your units carry the day. These facings also determine a unit's arcs. Using only full ranks, not partial, draw an imaginary X through the opposite corners of the unit. The area between these lines to the unit's front becomes its front arc, to the back, the rear arc, and to the sides, the flank arcs. So let's get into combat. If your unit makes a move action and contacts an enemy unit, they are now in combat. They immediately engage and fight a round of combat, no additional action required. Note that this has to be a move action, not a manoeuvre. You place the attacking unit, the one that moved, flush with the facing of the defending unit that was contacted, and line up the officer with the centre of that facing. If the attacking unit would hit a unit's corner, determine which arc of the defending unit the officer of the attacker is in before you make the move. This will be the facing where the charge lands. Move the unit and centre the officer as if the unit had contacted on that facing as normal. Effectively, to hit a unit in the flank or rear from the corner, the attacking officer must be in the defender's flank or rear arc before moving into combat. Combat happens simultaneously, so both sides carry out each of the following steps at the same time. First, we determine the number of combat dice to roll. To do this, we look at the combat dice stat of one non-character model in the unit, typically this will be 1, and multiply it by the number of models in the front rank, up to a maximum of 5 dice. If a unit is fighting to its flank or rear, you take the combat dice stat of a non-character model and multiply it by the number of complete ranks in the unit, with a minimum of 1. Next up, we determine the target number. Grab your opponent's unit's defense value and subtract your unit's fight value. Then add or subtract any appropriate modifiers from the combat modifier table, such as extra ranks or attacking the flank, and the result becomes the target number. The various tables can be quickly found in the back of the book or on the reference sheet you can download from the Osprey Games website, link in the description. Though thankfully there's not too many modifiers, so they're fairly easy to remember. That's by the book. You'll see in my videos that I add or subtract all of the modifiers to the unit's fight value, then determine the target number. That works better for me, and I think it's clearer on screen. Different strokes, same result. Both sides will roll their combat dice, and each die with a result greater than or equal to the target number results in a hit. Add all of the hits together to get a total. Then models are removed from the unit until the total number of health removed is equal to the total number of hits. Most models only have 1 health, so this is easy. Just remove 1 model per hit, but some models such as trolls or ogres have a health stat greater than 1. In this case, all hits are applied to a single model until its health has been depleted, then move on to the next in line. No spreading hits out among the whole unit, I'm afraid. Once all of the hits have been allocated, any unit that suffered casualties must make a morale check, which we'll cover a little later on. The unit that scored the most hits is the winner of the combat and has a choice to make. They can either move back 1 inch or choose to push the enemy unit back, either 1 or 6 inches. If both units caused the same number of hits, the combat was a tie and both sides moved back 1 inch. Any unit that is involved in a combat counts as having been activated for the rest of the turn. So if your unit is attacked before it can activate, well, I'm afraid you're out of luck. You'll have to get in quick next turn. Shooting is resolved in much the same way. The shooting unit must be able to draw a line of sight to its target, it must be in range, and unless stated otherwise, must shoot at the closest target. Determine how many combat dice you roll in the same way as combat, and compare the unit's shoot stat to the target's defense to determine the target number. This is further modified by things like number of ranks and cover as shown in the shooting modifier table. Once you've determined hits and removed any casualties, the targeted unit makes a morale test if it lost any models. So speaking of morale tests, these are nice and easy. You roll 2 dice and compare them to the unit's activation stat. The roll can be modified depending on the situation. For example, you subtract 1 for each casualty taken and add 1 if it's from a shooting attack. Note that casualties taken only refers to those causing the current morale test, not casualties suffered earlier in the game. If at least 1 of the dice is equal to or greater than the unit's activation stat, it passes. If both are below, that's a failure. A unit that fails a test becomes disordered. A unit that is disordered receives a penalty to its roll, making it harder to activate, making it worse in combat and shooting, and making it easier for the unit to fail future morale tests. A disordered unit that successfully activates is no longer disordered. If a disordered unit fails a second morale test, it becomes broken and is removed from the table. Their flight can turn the battle into a rout, as every friendly model within 8 inches must also make a morale test in what's called cascading panic, potentially causing your lines to fall apart. There is more nuance among many of the rules covered, and there are more advanced rules covering characters, artillery, monsters, terrain, strange events, special rules, and so on and so forth, but that's the basics. I hope that's helped out and given you an idea on how to play the game. I have a load of narrative battle reports on the channel already that'll give you a great feel for how the game plays, show some of the different units and models, and hopefully entertain you, so please check those out if you're interested. If you have any further questions or comments, please feel free to leave those down in the comments section below. And thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Cheers!